Trump's doing this because he knows I'll beat him like a drum. And he's using the abuse of power and every element of the presidency to try to do something to smear me.
As former Vice President and 2020 presidential candidate Joe Biden pointed out to the media on Saturday, we remain in the midst of what could be the worst of 3 years' worth of Trump scandals, one that could finally push House Democrats to pull the impeachment lever. According to the Wall Street Journal, Donald Trump repeatedly attempted to pull foreign election interference 2.0, allegedly pressuring the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his family, essentially trying to do to Biden what Russia did to Hillary Clinton in 2016, paging Robert Mueller. Ukraine's foreign minister is denying any pressure took place during the July 25th phone call between Donald Trump and the president of Ukraine, emphasizing that Ukraine prizes close relations and open lines of communication with the United States, no matter who the American president is. Now, that should not surprise you, since Ukraine relies on the U.S. for military aid. Picking a fight with the American president, no matter who that is, would not be wise for them. Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to meet on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly with Trump this week. Now, we're going to talk more about that, but first I want to take you back. I want to take you back a year ago, last July, when NBC's Andrea Mitchell had a conversation with one Dan Coats, who at the time was Donald Trump's Director of National Intelligence.
I do want to say we have some breaking news. The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming
Did I
to
hear
the...
you? Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
That weird moment with Andrea Mitchell may be a hint as to why Dan Coats didn't last as DNI. His pretty visible shock at just how chummy his boss, Donald Trump, clearly wanted to be with Vladimir Putin seemed to throw him off. Well, fast forward 1 year to July of this year. Dan Coats resigned. And that resignation shows up in the timeline of the whistleblower case that's now shaking Washington. The phone call between Donald Trump and the president of Ukraine took place on July 25th of this year. Dan Coats announced his resignation just 3 days later, on July 28th. But according to CNN, a little over a week after Coats' announcement and before he officially stepped down, Coats walked into a meeting to tell his deputy, Sue Gordon, that she too needed to get out of Dodge, which she did the very next day. Now, were these resignations mere coincidences, or did Donald Trump's alleged behavior during that phone call, the same one the Ukraine foreign minister is now downplaying, lead the whistleblower to come forward and lead Dan Coats' replacement, acting DNI Joseph Maguire, to get in between that whistleblower's complaint and Congress? Joining me now is Mehni Hassam, columnist for The Intercept, and Malcolm Nance, MSNBC contributor and author of The Plot to Destroy Democracy. Thank you all for being here. Malcolm, I got to go to you first and get you to react to Mike Pompeo this morning, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, who was on ABC this morning defending Donald Trump. He's asked about the reporting on the call with the president of Ukraine. Take a listen.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting that President Trump pressed the president of Ukraine 8 times to work with Rudy Giuliani to investigate Joe Biden's son. What do you know about those conversations?
So you just gave me a report about a high-seek whistleblower campaign, none of which I've seen. I think I saw a statement from the Ukrainian foreign minister yesterday said there was no pressure applied in the course of the conversation. I do think if Vice President Biden behaved inappropriately, if he was protecting his son and intervened with the Ukrainian leadership in a way that was corrupt, I do think we need to get to the bottom of that.
Now, I don't know what you hear when you hear that, Malcolm Nance. What I heard was a Trump official pretending he'd never heard the biggest story in the news right now. He's in the government. The White House was briefed on this case, but he says he's never heard of it except a report he's just hearing. But then doing an interesting pivot where he tries to get the focus back on Joe Biden's son. Your thoughts?
That is meta-narrative judo you just saw there. where what he did was he took the story, pretended like it doesn't exist, and then reframes it as a criminal conspiracy to attack Joe Biden. Obviously, Mike Pompeo is neck deep in this story because we understand from New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporting that the State Department may have facilitated this meeting, if not coordinated this meeting. That is yet to be determined. That is something that needs to be investigated, and he needs to be hauled in. But let's take a look at this entire story from the intelligence community's perspective. You have the President of the United States literally going out and trying to extort the government of the Ukraine to intervene in an American election a la Russia, but using U.S. military sales while they are in combat with Russia, Donald Trump's best friend, Vladimir Putin. So by putting this pressure onto them, right, U.S. intelligence, by the way, has an obligation to monitor the communications and activities of virtually all foreign leaders, and Donald Trump seems surprised that we're doing that. This sounds very familiar. That happened when Michael Flynn was caught talking to the Russians and essentially committing acts which betrayed his oath of office and would later essentially convict him of lying to the FBI. This is fantastic that the President of the United States now has weaponized extortion of U.S. military aid to foreign leaders in order to further his political goals. If there is anything that is ever in the history of the United States that is impeachable, this is it.
And there was an interesting, you talk about meta-narrative, Mehdi. What you have here are two different stories that the Trump backers are really playing to try to merge them together and turn them into a Joe Biden scandal. On the one hand, you have Rudy Giuliani, who admitted, like within 30 seconds of denying it, that he was trying to push the Ukrainian government to investigate Joe Biden. And now the narrative all over the right this morning, if you read all of their, posts and tweets, is somebody needs to look into Joe Biden. Joe Biden's got something wrong. His son, look into the son. But what the foreign minister said, the part of the translation that I saw online, in which he said, we work with parties on both sides of the United States. We weren't trying to do anything here that was illegal, that was off key. We work with everyone regardless of who they are. And now you have the Trump people trying to push back and sort of erase the part of the Giuliani part of the story and to try to shift the narrative onto the part of the story that has to do just with Joe Biden. What do you think?
Oh, there's so much to say about this story. As for the Ukrainian denials, what are the Ukrainians going to do? Come out and say, yes, Donald Trump did pressure our president 8 times in a single phone call. I mean, it's absurd, Pompeo citing that. You're right about the pivoting, as is Malcolm. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, was on CNN this morning. He tried to pivot to we need to investigate Biden's son. When Jake Tapper said, well, what about Trump's kids? He didn't want to talk about that. I mean, you have to admire the brazenness of the hypocrisy when it comes to Donald Trump's attacks on his opponents. For this president of all presidents to attack the child of a rival, I mean, should we talk about Ivanka Trump and her Chinese trademarks? And should we talk about Don Jr. and Eric and the Trump organization and the non-existent Chinese wall between them and the guy in the Oval Office? I mean, it's the irony beyond irony, but the Republicans are good at this stuff. They're shameless, they're brazen, they take advantage of the whole media, both sidesism, and therefore they're going to continue doing this. And I think Trump's going to carry on doing this stuff because, Joy, one thing that's missing from your timeline that you showed at the start, for me, a very crucial date, July 25th is the day he made the call to the Ukrainian president, allegedly 8 times pressured him to investigate Biden's son. What happened on July 24th? The day before, Robert Mueller testifies in Congress saying this president has not been exonerated, this president could still be indicted after he leaves office. And what happens? Nothing. No change in the Democratic leadership's position on impeachment. So if you're Donald Trump and you see, wait a minute, I can get away with 2016, why wouldn't you do it again in 2020?
Yeah, and the thing is, Malcolm, is that there is this interesting, there's a bifurcation here in this story, in that the Giuliani part of the story is about whether or not he's trying to get an investigation going. There is no reporting that I've seen, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, whether it is the Washington Post or the New York Times, that says the call was about the investigations necessarily, but then there is this tie to the money. Because the thing that they may or may not have even known was happening was that the money that should have gone to Ukraine for their defense was actually on hold. So we don't know whether the conversation was about, hey, about the money, about the aid that was being held up to Ukraine. These could have been two separate conversations, and even if they're part of the same scandal, the conversation didn't necessarily have to be Donald Trump repeating what Rudy Giuliani was doing. It could have simply been about the money. The foreign minister talked about this being serious conversations about serious issues. They didn't say what it was about, but what do you think about that? Because the question is, if Donald Trump was talking to them about their aid and how they could get it or not get it, that is the same scandal, which would mean you can't get the money unless you do what I want.
Well, I always use what I call Nance's law, and that is coincidence takes a lot of planning. And in this circumstance, the planning is phenomenal. There is no way that anyone can believe that Ukrainian defense allocation was suddenly held up, which, by the way, benefits only Moscow and only places pressure on the Ukraine. That was actually a surprise around the Capitol that was being done, that the United States was considering not giving that lethal aid to the Ukraine. So the Ukrainians know that. So they're between a rock, Vladimir Putin and his forces, which are literally killing the Ukrainian soldiers every day, in a new hard place. Donald Trump literally going to hold up lethal aid to the Ukraine, which it took years for us to get to them, in order to benefit Vladimir Putin. So if you're Zelensky, you're going to sit there and say, look, I'm going to try to finesse this. Donald Trump's supposedly a deal maker. He doesn't understand. Donald Trump in this circumstance looks like he's working for Moscow.
And let me Neil Katyal, former Solicitor General, tweeted yesterday about the way that they're sort of shifting the narrative on the Trump side. He says the switch in strategy away from denying it happened at all to say, no, there was nothing wrong with it. Donald Trump called the conversation perfect this morning on Talking to the Press, may mean that Trump finally read something, the transcript of the call. Also, isn't this the same guy who 2 days ago denied the story because he knows his calls with foreign leaders are heavily populated, but now he's saying the call wasn't? What do you make of this? Because they're playing in between here. First they said, no, it didn't happen. Then Giuliani said, yeah, it happened. And now they're saying, well, there was nothing wrong with the call, but now they're shifting to really go after the whistleblower and say this person was, a spy, or they shouldn't have been on the call in the first place.
But this is classic Trump administration defense strategy on every scandal that's happened so far. There's always the denial, and then there's the embrace. There's we didn't talk about Ukraine, but if we did, who cares? We didn't collude with Russia, but if we did, who cares? That's always been the position, and it was only a matter of time before they start going after kind of quote-unquote deep state conspiracy theories. I said this a few days ago when the story broke on Thursday, earlier in the week, that they are eventually going to say this whistleblower is part of some conspiracy against the president. You saw Trump say, we don't know who he or she is, but then he also says, oh, they're a partisan, which is classic Trump. How do you know they're a partisan if you don't know who they are? All of the contradictions come out throughout. He has his Republican enablers, people like Senator Josh Hawley, who was on TV this weekend saying, this is the deep state again, and they will keep pushing this argument. They will, on one front, attack the whistleblower and attack the whole story as a conspiracy. You have Trump saying enemies of the people again this morning, which we've become almost numb to, which is an outrageous thing to say about the press, a Stalinistic statement. And on the other hand, they'll carry on saying, but, Biden's son needs to be investigated. By the way, I'm of the view that Biden's son is a problem for Biden. There's a long history of dodgy dealings that his son's involved in. That doesn't make Trump's attacks true, but it does make it a weakness for Biden. But that's what the Republicans are so good at, and the Democrats always bring a knife to a gunfight. Are they going to be able to push back in the same way? Have we seen the Democrats focus on Jared and Ivanka on any kind of similar level to the way that Trump has gone after the former vice president's son? No.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that deep tease, because that's our 11 o'clock A block that we're going to talk about, whether or not the Democrats are ready to fight this fight, as you said, Mehdi. And interesting end note to this, just as Donald Trump was able to replace a less compliant Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who had his own issues, with a more compliant Bill Barr, we note, as I go back to the clip I played earlier, Dan Coats, who seemed to be a less compliant, slightly less compliant figure, now gone. His replacement is the one who won't let Congress have that whistleblower's complaint. Just interesting moves there. Mehni Hassam, thank you very much for being here. Always great to talk to you. And Malcolm Nance, we'll be back in our next hour.